Send the boy away. Calvin Brody's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. He didn't whisper it. He didn't pull Rowan aside and say it quietly, man to man. He said it standing in the middle of the yard, loud enough for the ranch hands to hear, loud enough for the neighbors to nod along, and loud enough, God help him, for an 8-year-old boy standing 20 feet away to hear every single word. Eli didn't flinch. That was the worst part. He just stood there holding a feed bucket with both hands, staring at the dirt, his small shoulders already carrying the kind of weight that had no right being on a child. He'd learned not to react. He'd learned that the world would say hard things and keep moving, and the only safe place was silence. But Elena Whitlock, 3 weeks a bride, still learning where the spare blankets were kept, heard it too. And she did not stay quiet. If this story moves something in you, something that maybe needed moving, please take a second and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city and country, because I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The letter had taken 11 days to reach her. Elena found it tucked between a seed catalog and a water bill. The envelope slightly bent at one corner like it had been handled more than once before making its way to her kitchen table in Crawfordsville, Indiana. The handwriting on the outside was careful. Not elegant, but careful, the kind of penmanship that told you the person holding the pen was thinking hard about every letter. She recognized it immediately. She'd received 4 letters from Rowan Mercer over the past 3 months, and each one had that same quality, deliberate, measured, like a man who chose his words the way a carpenter chose his lumber, not for how it looked, but for whether it would hold. She stood at the table and read it standing up, the way you read news you're not sure is good or bad yet. Miss Whitlock, I won't waste your time with poetry. I'm 36, a widower, and I run a cattle ranch outside a small town called Grover's Bend in Kansas. The ranch is called Crane Ridge. It's not a beautiful name, and the land isn't always beautiful either, but it's honest land, and I've worked it for 12 years. I have 340 acres, a working well, and a house with 3 bedrooms that is clean but not fancy. I got your name from the Crawfordsville Register, where you placed a notice 6 weeks ago. I don't usually write to strangers, but I've read your notice 3 times now, and I think you mean what you say. Most notices say, seeking companionship. Yours said, seeking a life worth building. That's a different thing. I have to tell you something that most men in my position would wait to tell you. I have an 8-year-old boy living with me. His name is Eli. He's my nephew. My younger brother's son. My brother and his wife were killed in a wagon accident last October. Eli survived. He hasn't spoken since. The doctors say there's nothing wrong with him physically. He hears fine, he understands, he just stopped. I don't know how to fix it. Some people around here say he never will. I don't want to deceive you about what you'd be walking into. If you want to keep writing, I'll keep writing. If not, I understand. Rowan Mercer. She sat down after all. Not because she was overwhelmed, or not only that, but because something in her chest had shifted. That feeling wasn't pity. She'd felt pity before, and pity always came with a slight backward lean, a safe distance built into the emotion. This was something else. This was recognition. She'd spent 6 years teaching 3rd grade in a one-room schoolhouse outside Crawfordsville. In that time, she had watched children shut down in 100 different ways. Not all of them were dramatic. Some just went quiet. They still came to school, still sat in their seats, still turned in their slates with the answers written on them. But something behind their eyes had switched off, like a lamp in a window that somebody forgot to relight. She'd learned, slowly and not without failure, that the worst thing you could do was make a production out of bringing them back. The second worst thing was giving up. She wrote back the next morning. Mr. Mercer, thank you for being honest. A lot of people aren't. I'll be honest too. I'm 29 years old, I've never been married, and I left my teaching position last spring after my mother passed and the house I'd been keeping for us both was sold. I'm not looking for rescue, and I'm not offering it, but I am looking for something real. About Eli. I've known children like him. Not exactly like him, nothing is exact, but children who went somewhere inside themselves and needed time to find their way out. I don't know your nephew, and I won't pretend I do, but I don't think he's broken. I think he's grieving. Those are different things. If you want to keep writing, I'll keep writing. Elena Whitlock. They wrote for 4 more months. The letters got longer. He told her about the calving season and the cost of hay and a neighbor named Calvin Brody, who had strong opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. She told him about the school and about her mother and about the winter she'd spent essentially alone in a house that had started to feel more like a shell than a home. Neither of them used the word lonely. Neither of them had to. By February, she had agreed to come. By March, she had packed what she owned into 2 trunks and a carpet bag. By the first week of April, she was on a westbound train watching the flat Indiana fields give way to something wider and sterner and more unforgiving, the sky getting bigger with every mile until it felt like the land was just something the sky was resting on. She wasn't afraid exactly, but she wasn't sure either. That felt honest. Rowan met her at the Grover's Bend station on a Tuesday afternoon. He was taller than she'd imagined. Not lean, but not heavy. The kind of solid that comes from actual work rather than any particular intention. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been set for decades and wasn't planning on changing. He held his hat in both hands and said, "Miss Whitlock," and she said, "Mr. Mercer." And for a moment, they just looked at each other the way you look at a sum you've worked out on paper and are now checking against the real numbers. "The wagon's out front," he said. "All right," she said. That was the courtship. Or the end of it, anyway. They got married 2 days later in the county clerk's office with a woman named Dottie Haynes as witness, a round-faced woman who kept dabbing at her eyes despite having met Elena 40 minutes before. Rowan signed the paper with the same careful handwriting as his letters. Elena signed her name next to his. The clerk said, "Congratulations," and shook Rowan's hand, and Dottie hugged Elena and whispered, "He's a good man. He just doesn't know how to show it yet." Elena filed that away. On the drive out to the ranch, Rowan told her 3 things she needed to know. The well water was good, the stove ran hot, so she should adjust for that, and Eli knew she was coming. "Does he want me here?" Elena asked. Rowan kept his eyes on the road. "I don't know. I don't always know what he wants. I'm not sure he knows either." "That's all right," she said. "That's honest." He glanced at her sideways, just briefly. "You say that a lot." "Say what?" "That's honest. Like it's a compliment." "It is," she said. He didn't respond to that, but something in his posture shifted slightly, like a door that had been braced against the wind letting up an inch. Eli was sitting on the porch steps when they pulled up to the house. He was small for 8, or maybe he just seemed small because of the way he held himself, shoulders drawn in, chin down, like he was trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. Dark eyes. His father's eyes, Rowan had mentioned once. He watched the wagon stop. He watched Elena climb down. He did not run over. He did not wave. He simply watched, the way a deer watches something at the edge of a field. Not hostile, not trusting, just watchful. Elena looked at him. She did not smile hugely. She did not crouch down and try to meet him at eye level, the way she'd seen adults do, as if children don't notice when you're performing warmth at them. She just looked at him the same way he was looking at her. Then she said, "I'm Elena," and turned to help Rowan with the trunks. Later, in Shibchad, she heard the porch steps creak. She didn't look up from where she was unpacking the smaller of the 2 trunks. She just kept moving things from the trunk to the shelf. The creaking stopped. She thought she could feel him in the doorway, that particular quality of silence that has a presence behind it. She didn't turn around. She didn't say anything. After a while, the creaking started again, going away. That night, eating supper at the kitchen table with Rowan, Eli had taken his plate to the corner of the room near the window, which Rowan told her quietly was his habit. Elena said, "What did he used to be like, before?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. "Loud," he said finally, and something flickered across his face that he put away just as quickly as it appeared. "He used to talk the whole time he was awake. His mother said he talked in his sleep, too." Elena looked at Eli's corner. The boy was eating carefully, methodically, without looking at them. "He remembers how," she said. Rowan looked at her. "I know that," he said, and his voice was slightly harder than she expected. Not angry, but the way a person sounds when someone says a thing they've been telling themselves for months and haven't quite been able to make themselves believe. She didn't push it. She just nodded and looked back at her plate. The first week was about learning the shape of things, where the tools were kept, which of the cattle were trouble, when Rowan got up in the morning, 4:30, which she matched without complaint, having grown up on a farm, what Eli would eat and what he wouldn't, what the sound of this particular piece of Kansas was. Wind, mostly. Wind and the distant lowing of cattle and the sound of the wood in the walls settling at night. She learned that Eli had a system. He would not sit at the table during meals if anyone was already there. He came to doorways and stood in them for long seconds before deciding whether to come in. He carried a smooth gray stone in his left front pocket at all times. She noticed this on day 3, the way his hand always went to it when something uncertain was happening. She didn't mention the stone. She filed it. She learned that Rowan slept 4 hours and called it enough. She learned that he'd been running this ranch essentially alone since long before his brother died. Before that, too, she suspected. And that the skin around his eyes had the specific tightness of a man who had trained himself not to need anything from anyone, because needing things had always cost more than he could afford. She learned that the neighbor Rowan had mentioned, Calvin Brody, came by more often than seemed necessary for a man who simply owned the adjacent land. He was big-shouldered, early 50s, with the particular confidence of someone who had been the most certain person in every room he'd been in for 30 years. He shook Elena's hand the first time he met her, looked at her the way you look at a piece of equipment you're not sure is up to the job, and said, "Brave of you, coming out here to all this." "I don't know that it's brave," she said pleasantly. "It's just where I am now." He'd laughed, a short, surprise sound, like she'd turned out to be more complicated than expected, and gone to talk to Rowan about fence line. She heard him, on his way back out to his horse, say to Rowan, "Seems capable enough, but that boy—" And then his voice dropped, and she didn't hear the rest. She didn't need to. She felt it start then, something small and quiet in her chest. Not anger, not yet. Just attention. The kind of attention you give to something you know is going to become a problem. On the 8th day, she found Eli standing at the fence of the west pasture, watching a cow that had separated herself from the herd and was pacing in irregular circles. Elena had come to check the water trough. She stood near him and watched the cow too. Neither of them said anything. After a while, Elena said, "She's been at it since before breakfast. I noticed at first light." Not to him exactly, just out loud, the way you'd say something to yourself if you wanted to say it to someone. Eli didn't respond, but he also didn't leave. She went back to the house. She came back an hour later. He was still there. She stood next to him again and looked at the cow. "Your uncle says she's done this before. Lost a calf last year and spent 3 days walking that same circle." She paused. "I don't know much about cattle yet, but that seems like grief to me." She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked at the cow. The stone in Eli's pocket made a small sound as his hand closed around it. Neither of them moved for a long time after that. She went inside and made supper and set 3 plates on the table, and when she looked up from the stove, Eli was sitting at the table. Not in his corner. At the table. Rowan came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway. He looked at Eli, then at Elena. She was already looking at the stove. She did not make anything of it, but Rowan did. She could feel it. The shift in him, the slight unsteadiness of a man who has prepared himself for the floor to always be the same height and has just found a step he didn't know was there. He sat down. Eli kept eating. Elena brought the bread. That was the 8th day. The days after that were not magical. Nothing clicked into place and stayed there. Eli still spent most mornings alone. He still went to doorways and reconsidered. He still did not speak. Not a word. Not in her earshot anyway, and she was fairly certain not in anyone's earshot, because Rowan had told her once, flatly, that he hadn't heard the boy's voice in 7 months, and the way he said it told her he was counting. She did not try to reach Eli. She simply stayed in motion around him. She fixed things that needed fixing, learned the cattle's names and habits, planted 3 rows of kitchen garden at the south side of the house. She talked to Rowan in the evenings the way you talk to someone you're genuinely trying to know, asking real questions, listening to the actual answers, not performing interest but having it. She thought Rowan didn't know what to do with that. She thought he was starting to get used to it. Calvin Brody came by on the 14th day. He sat at the kitchen table while Elena poured coffee, and he said to Rowan, without particularly lowering his voice, "Have you thought any more about what I mentioned? About the boy?" Rowan's jaw tightened slightly. "No." There are places, Calvin said, in Topeka. They know how to handle cases like his. He doesn't have a case, Rowan said. He's 8 years old. Rowan, Calvin's voice went patient in the way that means I've already decided you're wrong, and I'm waiting for you to catch up. I'm saying this as someone who's known you 15 years. The boy needs help you can't give him, and now you've got a new wife to think about. It's not fair to either of them. Elena set the coffee pot down on the table quietly and said, Mr. Brody, how long did you say you'd known Rowan? Calvin looked at her. 15 years, give or take. And how long have you known Eli? A beat. Since he was born. And in that time, she said, still pleasant, still folding the dish towel in her hands, what's the most you've heard him say in one sitting? Calvin's eyes narrowed slightly. I don't see what that has to... I'm curious, she said. I'm still learning about everyone here. What was he like? Before? Calvin shifted in his seat. He was a normal boy, talked plenty, ran around. You know how boys are. A normal boy, she said. So, not someone whose mind was broken to begin with. Silence. Not broken, Calvin said carefully. But now he's silent, Elena said. Yes, he is. She picked up her coffee cup. A normal boy who stopped talking after watching his parents die. That's not a broken mind, Mr. Brody. That's a broken heart. They're not the same thing. And I can tell you from some experience that you can't fix a broken heart by sending it away. Calvin looked at Rowan. Rowan was looking at Elena. I'll let you men talk, she said, and walked out to the garden. She didn't hear what they said after that. She told herself she didn't need to. But her hands weren't quite steady when she picked up the trowel, and she made herself breathe slowly until they were. She didn't think she'd handled it gracefully. She thought she might have made an enemy of a man who would be easier as an ally. She thought Rowan might be irritated with her for pushing into a conversation she hadn't been formally invited into. She was still thinking all of that when she heard the back door open. She didn't look up. Rowan crouched down beside her in the dirt, not something she expected from a man of his size and his general economy of movement. He's gone, he said. I may have overstepped, she said. Maybe, he said. Then, you were right, though. She looked at him. He was looking at the row of planted seeds. I know what's wrong with Eli. I've always known what's wrong with him. I don't know how to make it better. And Calvin's been telling me for months that there's a place that can. There isn't a place, she said. No, he agreed. I don't think there is either. He picked up a small piece of broken clay and turned it over in his fingers, and then set it back down. I just get tired of not being able to fix it. That was the most she'd heard him say about it in 3 weeks. She didn't know what to do with it except to not waste it. I know, she said. They stayed like that in the dirt for another few minutes, not talking, just present. That was day 4. 11 days later, 25 days into her life at Crane Ridge, the heifer in the East Barn went into labor 2 weeks early, and everything went wrong at once, and without meaning to, without planning it, or knowing where it would lead, Elena Whitlock handed an 8-year-old boy who hadn't spoken in 8 months a newborn calf. And the world, very slowly, began to change. The heifer had been laboring since before midnight. Elena knew it before Rowan told her, because she'd heard him get up at 2 a.m, heard his boots on the floor, the specific way he moved when something was wrong versus when he was just going to check on things. There was a weight to it, a purpose that was also a dread. She lay still for a minute after he left, then got up and put on her coat over her nightgown and followed him out to the East Barn without being asked. The barn was cold, not the deep cold of January, but the mean, damp cold of early April that gets into the joints and stays there. Rowan was already crouched at the back of the stall when she came in, his sleeves pushed up, a lantern hung on the post above him, throwing yellow light across the straw. The heifer, a young red cow, barely 2 years old, this being her first calf, was down on her side, and her breathing was the fast, shallow kind that meant she'd been at it long enough to be afraid. How bad? Elena said. Calf's turned wrong. He didn't look up. I've been trying to correct it for 40 minutes. She's wearing out. Elena crouched on the other side of the heifer and put her hand flat on the animal's ribs. The breathing came fast against her palm. "What do you need?" "Another pair of hands." He glanced at her then. Just a look, checking whether she meant it. She looked back at him steadily. He nodded once. She wasn't a rancher. She'd grown up on a farm, but they'd kept chickens and a kitchen garden and one elderly horse named Thomas, who'd died peacefully when Elena was 16. She had never assisted in a birth of any kind, but she was not going to stand outside the stall and wait. She pulled her coat sleeves up and came around to where Rowan was working and did what he told her to do. And she didn't flinch when it was unpleasant, and she didn't ask questions that weren't necessary, and after another 20 minutes of work that left them both breathing hard and the heifer making low sounds that Elena felt in her back teeth, the calf came. It was a small thing, too small maybe. She couldn't tell, not knowing what normal looked like. It lay in the straw and didn't move, and for a long, terrible second, Elena thought they were too late. Then Rowan rubbed it hard with a fistful of straw, rough and quick, and the calf shuddered and made a thin, reedy sound and moved its legs in a weak, uncoordinated way, like it wasn't sure yet what legs were for. "There," Rowan said under his breath, more to himself than to her. The heifer raised her head. Elena waited for what she'd always heard about. The way a mother animal turns to her newborn, the instinct. It was supposed to be immediate. It was supposed to be the thing that made all the mess and effort make sense. The heifer looked at the calf for a long moment, then she put her head back down, her eyes closed. "She's not," Elena started. "I know." Rowan sat back on his heels. The exhaustion in his voice was particular, layered, not just the physical kind. "It happens sometimes. Young mothers especially. She's too worn out. Or something in her just—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his arm across his forehead. "She's not going to feed it." The calf was trying to get its legs under itself, that wobbling, uncertain effort that looked desperate and hopeful at the same time. Elena watched it. Something in her chest did a complicated thing she didn't have words for right at that moment. "So what do we do?" she said. "Bottle feed it. Every 4 hours, first few days. If it survives the night." He said the last part plainly, not cruelly, just honestly, the way people who work with animals learn to talk about mortality. It's small, and the first hour is everything. Elena was already reaching for the calf, getting her hands under it, when she heard a sound at the barn door. She turned. Eli was standing in the doorway in his nightshirt and boots, his coat not buttoned, holding the top of the doorframe with one hand. His eyes were on the calf. She didn't know how long he'd been there. She hadn't heard him come. Nobody moved for a second. Then Rowan started to stand up, started to say something. She could feel it. The reflex to send the boy back to bed, to manage the situation, to keep Eli away from something difficult. She touched Rowan's arm, just briefly, just enough. He stopped. She looked at Eli. His eyes were still on the calf, and they were wide and fixed and had something in them that she recognized, that thing you see in a person who is witnessing something so familiar to their own interior experience that they can't look away. Here was a small creature alone in the world. Here was a thing that had arrived and been left. Elena made a decision. She turned back to the calf, got her hands under its front and hindquarters, and lifted it, heavier than it looked, dense and warm, its legs dangling. She carried it the few steps to the doorway where Eli stood. She didn't crouch down. She didn't make her voice soft. She just held the calf out toward him the way you hand someone a tool they're needed for and said, "Hold him while I go get the bottle ready. Don't let him fall." Eli looked at the calf. He looked at her. Something passed across his face that she couldn't name and wouldn't try to. He held out his arms. She set the calf against his chest. The animal's head tucked immediately under Eli's chin, which was probably just warmth-seeking, probably just instinct. But Eli's arms tightened around it, and something in the set of his small jaw shifted in a way that looked like a person remembering something they thought they'd forgotten. "Don't let him fall," she said again. Then she went to get the bottle. Rowan was behind her at the supply shelf, his voice low. "Elena." Just her name, but it had a question in it, possibly more than one. "He needed something to hold on to," she said quietly, measuring the colostrum supplement into the bottle. "So does the calf." "He hasn't—" "I know." I just don't want him to. Yeah, I know. She turned and looked at her husband in the lantern light, this careful, controlled man who was so afraid of doing the wrong thing that he'd started doing nothing. Let him be useful. That's all I'm doing. She went back to the doorway. Eli was still there, still holding the calf, which had stopped its weak struggling and was now simply leaning into the boy's warmth. Eli's chin was resting on the top of the calf's head. He was looking out into the dark of the yard. He looked older than 8, standing there. He looked like he'd been somewhere and come back from it and wasn't entirely sure where he'd landed. Elena sat down on this crate beside the doorway, not next to him, not crowding him, and began feeding the calf, guiding the bottle to its mouth while Eli held it steady. The calf latched on with a desperation that was almost funny, sucking hard and fast like it was making up for lost time. Eli watched this with an expression that was the closest thing to interest she'd seen on his face in 25 days. They didn't talk. She didn't try to make them. When the bottle was empty, the calf's legs gave out entirely, and it went boneless and heavy in Eli's arms, asleep between one breath and the next. Eli held it anyway. Elena took the bottle back to the shelf. Rowan had set up a small pen with fresh straw in the corner of the barn, away from the heifer, and Elena took the calf from Eli's arms. Eli let go with a slight reluctance she felt more than saw, and settled it in the pen. She covered it with a piece of old burlap. She didn't know if that was the right thing. She did it anyway. Go back to bed, she said to Eli, not unkindly. We'll check on him at first light. He went. She heard his boots on the path back to the house. Rowan came to stand beside her at the pen, looking down at the sleeping calf. First light's in 2 hours, he said. I know. You don't have to eat. I'll be up, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, You're going to be tired. I've been tired before, she said, and picked up the lantern and walked back to the house. She was up at first light. Eli was already at the barn door. She didn't say anything about it. She got the bottle ready, and this time she handed it to Eli and showed him how to hold it. Angle slightly up, make sure the calf's head wasn't twisted, and then she stepped back and let him do it. He was clumsy with it at first, the bottle slipping, the calf pulling in a direction he wasn't expecting. But he adjusted. He figured it out. And when the calf was drinking steadily, when Eli had the bottle at the right angle and his other hand braced against the calf's jaw, a look of concentration settled over his face that made him look, for just a moment, like a completely ordinary 8-year-old who had learned how to do something. Rowan came in from the field at 7:30 and stopped at the barn door. He looked at Elena. She looked at him. She tilted her head slightly toward Eli, who was now sitting cross-legged in the straw with the calf's head in his lap, his hand moving slowly across its ears. Rowan leaned against the doorframe and watched for a long time without saying anything. The calf survived the first day. It survived the second. It was not a graceful survival. It was all wobbling legs and demanding sounds, and Eli dragging himself out of bed at 4:30 in the morning, which Elena discovered on the third day when she came to the barn before dawn and found him already there, his hair uncombed, his coat on inside out, the bottle in his hands, and his face set with the particular seriousness of someone who has decided something is their responsibility and means to see it through. She fixed the coat collar and didn't say anything about it. On the fourth morning, Dottie Haynes came by with a pie and stayed for coffee, and while Elena was pouring, Dottie peered out the kitchen window toward the barn. Is that the Mercer boy out there? Eli, Elena said. Yes. He's been going back and forth all morning, watched him from the road. Dottie accepted her coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup. Rowan told my husband the calf lost its mother. The heifer rejected it. Dottie sipped. What's the boy calling it? Elena paused. She actually didn't know. She hadn't thought to ask, hadn't thought she could ask. I'm not sure he's named it yet. Dottie nodded and looked back out the window. He used to name everything when he was smaller before... She stopped, set her cup down. He used to name the chickens at his folks' place, named every one of them, drove his daddy half crazy because then he didn't want to eat them. Her voice had gone a little rough. She picked the cup back up. He was a funny little thing, so much to say about everything. Elena was looking at the window too, at the small figure moving between barn and fence. He will be again, she said. Dottie looked at her. Calvin Brody says, I know what Calvin Brody says, Elena said pleasantly. Dottie studied her for a moment. Then she laughed, a real laugh, shorter than expected. I like you, she said, like she was slightly surprised by it. Good, said Elena. Have some pie. It was on the 6th evening that Rowan, coming into the barn to hang a mended harness, heard it first. He stopped inside the door. Elena wasn't there. She'd gone in to start supper. It was just Rowan and the low sounds of cattle settling for the night and the wind beginning its Kansas complaint against the barn walls. And Eli, sitting in the straw of the small pen, the calf curled against his side. And a voice, small, rough from disuse, like a hinge that hadn't been turned in a long time. One word. Rowan couldn't make out what it was from where he stood. He didn't move. He didn't breathe wrong. He just stood there with the harness in his hands and let whatever was happening keep happening, aware, in some way that went below thought, that the wrong move would break it like a dry branch. He hung the harness quietly on the hook by the door, went back outside, stood in the evening air with his heart doing something complicated in his chest. He stood there for a long time before he trusted himself to walk to the house without showing it on his face. Elena was at the stove when he came in. She looked up at him. She read him like she'd been reading him for weeks now, efficiently, correctly, getting more off his face than he intended to put there. What happened? She said. He pulled out a chair and sat down. He put both hands flat on the table the way a man does when he needs something solid. He was talking to the calf, he said. I couldn't hear what he said, but he was talking. Elena turned back to the stove. She adjusted the flame under the pot. Her back was to him so he couldn't see her face, which was probably why she was turned away, because when she spoke her voice was completely level and measured. Good, she said. Supper in 15 minutes. He stared at the back of her. That's Elena. He hasn't said a word in 8 months. I know. And you're just good. Supper. She turned around, and he saw then that her eyes were wet, just slightly, not enough to call it crying, just enough to call it feeling. Because if I make a thing of it, she said, it becomes a thing. And right now it's just a boy talking to a calf. That's all it needs to be. She wiped the corner of one eye with the back of her wrist, a quick, almost impatient gesture, like she was annoyed at herself for letting it show. The moment we all stand around him with our mouths open, he'll feel like he's being watched, and a kid who feels watched closes back up. Rowan was quiet. He was thinking about the last 8 months, all the times he'd tried to gently coax Eli into speaking, the careful questions he'd asked that Eli had absorbed in silence, the nights he'd stood in the doorway of the boys' room wondering what you say to a child who has heard everything that words can do and decided they weren't worth the trouble. I didn't know what to do, he said, and it came out more plainly than he expected. I know, Elena said. She came to the table and sat across from him and looked at him directly, which she did more than anyone he'd met in his adult life. You were trying to fix it. That's not wrong. It's the wrong tool for this particular thing. And your tool is a half-dead calf. My tool is giving him something that needs him. She folded her hands on the table. Eli doesn't need someone to be patient at him. He needs to feel like he matters to something, like something in the world would be worse off without him doing his part. She paused. The calf would have died without him. He knows that. He feels that. And feeling necessary is... She stopped, chose her words. It's loud, in a quiet way. It takes up the space that grief was using. Rowan looked at her for a long time. The stove clicked and settled. Outside, the wind had picked up and was doing things to the eaves. Where did you learn that? He said. She thought about it honestly. A boy named Thomas Pruitt, she said, 3rd grade. His father left in the fall, and by December he'd stopped talking in class. Everyone thought he was sulking. I gave him the job of taking care of the schoolroom rabbit. She smiled, briefly, at something she was seeing that wasn't in the room. By February, he was giving the rabbit full daily reports. By spring, he was back. Rowan was quiet. Not every story ends in spring, he said, and she heard in it the thing he never said outright. The 12-year-old grief of a man who had spent his whole life knowing that some things don't get better. No, she agreed. Not every story. But Eli's not done yet. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. Then he said quietly, I keep thinking I should be doing more. I know. It feels wrong. Doing nothing while You're not doing nothing, she said. You're here. You kept him here when other people were suggesting you shouldn't. That matters. She leaned slightly forward. Rowan, you didn't send him away. Something moved across his face and was put away. He nodded once. Eli came in for supper that night. He sat at the table in his regular chair. He ate everything on his plate methodically, and when he was done, he looked at Elena with those dark, careful eyes, and then he looked at the breadbasket, and then he looked back at Elena. She passed him the bread. He took a piece, kept looking at his plate, but the tips of his ears went slightly pink, and Elena, who was looking at her own plate, missed it. Rowan, who was sitting directly across, did not. He didn't say anything about it. He refilled his coffee and passed the butter and let supper continue. But later, when Elena was washing up and Eli had gone to bed, Rowan lingered in the kitchen doorway and said, He looked at you when he wanted the bread. Hmm? Elena said. He points, usually, or just doesn't eat it. He looked at you. I noticed, she said. Okay, Rowan said, just that. He pushed off the door frame and went to check the barn. The following morning, the calf stood up on its own for the first time, really stood. Not the desperate wobbling of the first day, but a real, intentional standing, all four legs under it, head up, ears moving. Eli was there naturally, had been there since before Elena was up. And when she came into the barn with the morning bottle, she found him on his feet too, not in the pen but outside it, watching the calf through the slats with both hands gripping the wood, and his whole face changed, open in a way it hadn't been since she'd arrived, a way that reminded her of what Dottie had said. He used to have so much to say about everything. She stepped up beside him, watched the calf take one careful step, then another, and Eli said, Clover. She looked at him. He was still watching the calf. His knuckles were white on the pen slats. His voice had been so quiet it was almost only breath. That's a good name, she said. That was all. She went into the pen and got the bottle ready, and Eli came in behind her and took it from her hands, not asking, just taking it, because it was his job and they both understood that. And when Clover went for the bottle with that ferocious, uncomplicated hunger, Eli said it again, slightly louder, like he was testing whether the word would hold. Clover. The calf didn't care about the word. It cared about the bottle. But Eli said it like it was the most important word he knew, like naming a thing was the first step in making sure it stayed. Elena stayed in the pen for the length of the feeding and then left Eli to it. She walked back to the house and got to the kitchen and stood at the sink with the water running and let herself feel for exactly 1 minute the full weight of what was happening. Then she turned the water off and dried her hands and started the coffee. Rowan came in from the barn at 7. He stopped at the kitchen table and looked at her. Did you hear him? He said. Yes. He named it. Clover, she said. Rowan sat down in his chair. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. He sat there for a moment like that, which was the most she'd ever seen him let down, the most unguarded she'd seen him look. It only lasted a few seconds. Then he straightened up and reached for the coffee cup she'd set in front of him, and his face was arranged again, set and settled, but his eyes were red at the rims. He's going to be all right, Elena said. Yeah, Rowan said. He wrapped both hands around the mug. Yeah, I know. And the way he said it, she could tell that he was just now starting to actually believe it, that for 8 months he'd been saying versions of he'll be all right to neighbors and to himself and to the dark at 2 a.m, but that for the first time the words were starting to match something in him. She sat down across from him. They drank their coffee in the quiet morning. Outside, in the barn, a boy was talking to a calf, saying its name probably, telling it things. And the calf was listening, which is what the boy needed. Not advice, not patience, not someone performing hope at him, just something that turned toward him when he spoke and let him know that his voice, after all this time, still had the power to matter. That was the morning of the 7th day with Clover. What came the day after that? What walked onto the ranch the following afternoon with opinions and volume and the particular damage that confident men do when they mistake their certainty for wisdom was Calvin Brody. And this time he didn't stay in the kitchen. He came out to the barn. He came out to the barn where Eli was sitting with Clover, speaking in the low, continuous way he'd been doing for 2 days now, single words becoming phrases, phrases becoming something that had the rhythm, if not yet all the shape of conversation. Elena was nearby, at the supply shelf, inventorying feed, not watching Eli, just present, which was always the arrangement. She heard the barn door and looked up, expecting Rowan, and saw Calvin instead, big-shouldered in the afternoon light, his eyes going immediately to Eli and Clover. She watched him take in the scene. She watched the thing cross his face, something that started as surprise and moved towards something more complicated. Then he turned to her and said quietly, "How long has this been going on?" "A week," she said. Just as quiet. He nodded slowly. She could see him recalibrating something. "He talking?" "Some." Another slow nod. He looked back at Eli, who had noticed the presence but hadn't looked up, which was itself a kind of change. A month ago, he'd have retreated. "Still," Calvin said, and stopped. "Still what?" Elena said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is about to say a thing he has already decided on and is just waiting for the right moment. "I've been talking to some of the other ranchers," he said, "about the situation, about what's best." Elena set down her inventory count and turned to face him fully. Outside, the wind moved. The cattle in the near pasture made their low collective sound. Clover was shifting against Eli's side. Eli's hand moved across the calf's back, steady and slow. "And what did you decide?" Elena said. Calvin looked at her. Something in her voice had registered, a quality, a steadiness, a warning that she wasn't bothering to dress up as anything else. He'd come in expecting to manage this quietly. She could see that. He'd expected her to be easier to manage than Rowan. "There's going to be a gathering," he said. "The Brody place, Saturday. Some of the ranchers, their wives. Rowan's been invited. I think it's time we all sat down and talked plainly about what this boy needs." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Eli had gone still, the way he did when voices changed tone. His hand had stopped on Clover's back. "I'll let Rowan know," Elena said. Calvin nodded, settled his hat, and left. She turned back to the shelf. She heard Eli exhale, a long, slow breath, the kind that has been held. After a moment, she said, without turning around, "He's wrong about you. You know that." Silence. Then, very quietly, from Eli's direction, "How do you know?" She turned around. He was looking at her. Not at the calf, not at the floor. At her, directly, with those dark eyes that were his father's eyes, and also something entirely his own. His jaw was set. His hand had started moving again on Clover's back, the same slow rhythm. "Because broken things don't name what they love," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back down at Clover. His ears went pink again. Elena turned back to the inventory, but her hands, she noticed, were not shaking this time. Saturday came in cold and gray, the kind of April morning that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be winter still, and Rowan was quiet the whole drive to the Brody place. Elena watched the road. She'd said what she had to say the night before, which wasn't much, mostly just that she was coming with him, and that wasn't a question. And Rowan had looked at her for a moment and then nodded, and that had been the end of that particular conversation. What hadn't been said was the rest of it, that she didn't know exactly what Calvin had planned for this gathering, that she was more nervous than she intended to show, that she'd lain awake past midnight running through versions of what might happen and how to handle each one, and that none of the versions she'd constructed had felt entirely solid. She was not someone who had grown up being listened to in rooms full of men who had already decided. She was a school teacher from Indiana who had been married for 5 weeks. She knew what her standing was in a room like the one they were driving toward, and she knew it wasn't much. But she was going anyway. Eli had watched them leave from the porch. Just watched, the stone in his pocket, his chin level. Dottie Haynes was staying with him. That had been arranged without drama, Dottie arriving at 8 with a basket of biscuits, and the cheerful efficiency of a woman who understood when her presence was practical. When Elena had said goodbye to Eli that morning, she'd done it the same way she did everything with him now, simply, without ceremony, as if nothing unusual was happening. "We'll be back by noon," she'd said. He'd nodded. Then, as she was going down the steps, he'd said, Tell them Clover's doing fine. She'd stopped, turned around. He was looking at the barn, not at her, his jaw set at that particular angle she was starting to recognize as the one that meant he was working hard to seem like he wasn't working hard. I will, she said. She turned it over in her mind the whole drive. Tell them Clover's doing fine. He knew where they were going. Maybe not the specifics, but he knew the shape of it. Knew that some people in that room would be talking about him, about his future, about what was best for a boy who hadn't spoken for 8 months. He'd heard enough doorway conversations in his life. He wasn't stupid and he wasn't unaware. He was 8 years old and grieving and quiet, but he was paying attention to everything, and he'd sent a message. Through her. In 5 words. She held that thought carefully, like something that might break if she gripped it too hard. The Brody place was larger than Crane Ridge. Calvin had made sure over 20 years that everyone knew it was larger. The main house had a real parlor with furniture that had been brought out from Missouri and hadn't aged well in the Kansas air, but was still more furniture than most ranch homes had. When Rowan and Elena arrived, 3 other wagons were already hitched outside. Elena counted faces as they came through the door. 2 other ranchers she'd seen at a distance but not met. Their wives, a man she didn't recognize who turned out to be the county land assessor, and Calvin himself standing near the fireplace with a cup of coffee and the posture of a man hosting a meeting he has already chaired in his head. His wife, Marvell, took their coats. She was a thin, careful woman who pressed Elena's hand in both of hers and said quietly, "I made cake," in the tone of an apology. The introductions went around. Frank and June Alderman, who ran cattle 6 miles east and whose son had been in Eli's father's grade at school. Roy Hooper, younger, with a new beard he hadn't quite grown into, who ranched to the south and looked slightly uncomfortable about being there. The land assessor's name was Gerald something, and he didn't seem to know exactly why he'd been invited, which Elena thought was a small, useful piece of information. They sat down. Marvell poured coffee. The cake appeared. There was a few minutes of the kind of conversation that covers while people figure out who's going to say the hard thing first. Calvin said it first. "I appreciate everyone coming out." He set his cup on the side table. "I'll get to it. We're here because we have a neighbor. A good neighbor, Rowan. Nobody at this table has anything but respect for what you've built out at Crane Ridge, who's dealing with a situation that the rest of us have been watching with some concern." He paused. "The boy, Eli. He's been here 9 months since the accident. He's not improving, and I think it's time we talked honestly about what the right decision is." Rowan had his coffee cup on his knee. His hand around it was still. "He is improving," he said. Calvin's expression went careful. "Rowan, he named the calf last week," Rowan said. "He's been talking to it every day. He spoke to Elena 2 days ago." His voice was flat and factual, the way he said things when he felt most strongly about them. "That's improving." A small silence. Frank Alderman shifted in his chair. Roy Hooper looked at his coffee. "Talking to a calf," Calvin said gently, as if this were evidence for his side of the argument. "Talking," Rowan said, "after 8 months." Elena was watching the room. She saw the moment Calvin decided to go around Rowan, the slight pivot in his body toward the larger group. "I think we can all agree," he said, "that we want what's best for the child. And what's best, in the opinion of people I've spoken to, including a doctor in Salina who has dealt with cases like this, is a facility where he can receive proper care, professionals who are trained for this kind of—" "What kind?" Elena said. Calvin looked at her. The room looked at her. She hadn't raised her voice. She'd asked it the same way she'd ask someone to pass the bread. "I beg your pardon?" Calvin said. "What kind of case did the doctor in Salina say it was?" She set her own coffee cup on the table beside her, freeing her hands. "Did he examine Eli?" "No, I described the situation, and So he gave you an opinion about a child he's never met, based on a description you gave him." She paused. "And the description you gave him, did it include that Eli spent last Tuesday in the barn for 3 hours helping treat a sick calf? That he's been waking before dawn every day for a week to take over feeding duties on his own? That he named the animal and has been speaking to it increasingly, including this morning when he asked me to pass along that, and I'm quoting him, 'Clover is doing fine'?" The silence was different now. She felt it change quality. June Alderman had put down her cake fork. "Mrs. Mercer," Calvin said, and there was a patience in his voice that was also a warning, the tone of a man explaining something to someone he considers less equipped to understand it. "I don't doubt that you've seen encouraging signs. You're new here, and you've done well by the boy in the short time you've been at Crane Ridge. But you've been there 5 weeks. We've been watching Eli for 9 months. We knew his parents. We knew who he was before, and we've watched what he's... Then you know he was a normal, healthy, talkative child before October," Elena said. "You just said it yourself. A normal boy who had a great deal to say about everything. That's not the history of a child with a broken mind. That's the history of a child who watched something unsurvivable happen and is taking time to survive it." She looked around the room, not aggressively, not performing confidence she didn't have, just looking at each face, taking stock. "I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for 6 years. I've watched children go quiet for reasons that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with loss. And I can tell you that the worst thing, the single most damaging thing you can do to a child in that state is to remove him from the only home and the only person he has left." She looked back at Calvin. Because what that tells him, on the level that doesn't have words, is that his grief was too much, that he was too much, that the people who were supposed to keep him decided it was easier to let him go. The fire in the grate made a small sound. Outside, the wind was doing its usual business with the Kansas morning. Marvel Brody was looking at her hands. Frank Alderman cleared his throat. "She's not wrong about the boy, Calvin. I saw him at the feed store last week. He held the door for my wife, looked right at her." Calvin's jaw tightened slightly. "Frank, he held the door," Frank said again, more simply. "Kid who's lost his mind doesn't hold the door." Roy Hooper, who'd have been looking increasingly like a man who'd been told he was coming to a simple neighbor discussion and had arrived at something considerably thornier, said, "What exactly are you asking us to do, Calvin? Vote on it?" "I'm asking us to act in the child's interest," Calvin said, and some of the smoothness had left his voice now. "I'm asking Rowan to consider—" "I've considered it," Rowan said. He'd been quiet for several minutes. He set his coffee cup on the table in front of him and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the way he leaned when he was done being managed. "I considered it every night for 3 months after Daniel and Clara died. I considered it when Eli stopped talking, when I couldn't reach him, when I didn't know what to do." He paused. "I considered it again when you brought it up in my own yard in front of my ranch hands." His voice was very even. "And the answer is the same as it's always been. He's my brother's son. He stays." Calvin looked at him for a long moment. Some kind of calculation was happening behind his eyes. He turned to Elena, and she recognized the shift. If he couldn't move Rowan, he'd try a different pressure point. "Mrs. Mercer, I understand your instincts, but you have to appreciate that this is a hard life out here, and a new wife who's taken on a child with significant problems, that's not the start any couple deserves. Are you sure you're not letting your schoolroom instincts override what's actually realistic here?" The room went very still. Elena looked at him. She took a breath and let it out slowly. She thought about the barn at 2 a.m. and the colostrum supplement and a small calf shuddering to life in the straw. She thought about a boy holding his breath in a doorway deciding whether to come in. She thought about 5 words. "Tell them Clover's doing fine." "Mr. Brody," she said, "I'm going to say this once and I'd like you to actually hear it." She was not performing calm. She was actually calm, which was a different thing and felt different, steadier. "I did not come to Crane Ridge to take on a problem. I came to build a life. And the life I'm building includes Eli, because Eli is family, and family doesn't get sent away when they become inconvenient to manage." She paused. "You've been a good neighbor to Rowan. I believe that's true. But right now you are trying to take something from a child who has already lost everything, and you're calling it care. That's not care, that's convenience." Calvin's face had done something she hadn't seen it do before. It had gone uncertain, not angry, uncertain, as if a floor he'd been standing on for a long time had shifted slightly under his feet. Gerald the land assessor said, quietly but distinctly, "I didn't know that's what this was." He looked at Calvin. You told me it was a property boundary question? An extraordinary silence. Calvin looked at him. Gerald, because I don't have any business being at a meeting about a child, Gerald said. He stood up, looked at Elena, then at Rowan. I apologize for the confusion, Mr. Mercer. Ma'am. He picked up his hat from the arm of the chair. Marvell, thank you for the cake. He left. The door closed behind him. Roy Hooper made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He covered it with his coffee cup. What happened in the following minutes was not a dramatic reversal. It was messier than that. Calvin attempted twice more to steer the conversation back to his original position, and both times found himself in a room that had tilted against him in a way he hadn't anticipated. June Alderman asking careful but pointed questions about what exactly this facility in Salina could offer that a stable home and a patient family couldn't. Frank saying plainly that he thought the boy just needed time, Roy staying out of it, but staying, which told Elena something. Calvin was not a stupid man, and he was not, she was beginning to understand, entirely a bad one. He was a man who had decided something and had the kind of personality that did not backtrack easily. He genuinely believed he was right. That made him more dangerous in some ways and less in others. He did not concede. He wouldn't concede. That wasn't who he was. But when the gathering ended, Marvell's cake half eaten, the fire burned down, he walked Elena and Rowan to the door and said stiffly, I hope you're right about the boy, Mrs. Mercer. So do I, she said. He blinked. It was perhaps not the response he expected. You're not certain? I'm never certain, she said. Certainty is a luxury when you're dealing with people. But I'm willing to bet on him. That's different. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he nodded once and held the door. On the drive back, Rowan was quiet for the first mile. Then he said, Gerald Voss. The assessor? He's been Calvin's man for 15 years. Goes where Calvin tells him. Votes how Calvin tells him. He paused. I've never seen him walk out of one of Calvin's meetings. Elena looked at the road. He didn't like being misled about what the meeting was for. Nobody does. Another mile of silence. Then, you handled yourself in there. I was scared the whole time, she said. He looked at her. You didn't look it. No, she agreed. I learned that from teaching. Kids can smell fear and they'll use it, not because they're cruel, but because they need someone to not be scared so they don't have to be. She watched the flat land going by, the sky doing its enormous thing above it. I just applied the same principle to a room full of ranchers. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, but the nearest thing to it she'd heard from him. Short, genuine, surprised out of him. It changed his face considerably. She filed that too. When they got back to Crane Ridge, Dottie's wagon was still in the yard. They found her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and they found Eli at the kitchen table across from her with a cup of something and the remains of what appeared to have been a significant portion of the biscuits she'd brought. And they were... Elena stopped in the doorway and took this in. They were playing checkers. Eli looked up when they came in. He looked at Elena. She looked back at him. Clover's still fine, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was small. It was the smallest possible version of a smile. Barely a suggestion. A thing that might not have registered on a face she hadn't spent 5 weeks learning to read. But she read it clearly, and she held it like the thing it was, which was enormous, which was 8 months in the making, which was the first time she had seen anything like it. She took her coat off and went to the stove to see about lunch. Dottie left after the dishes were done, pressing Elena's hand at the door and saying nothing, which was more eloquent than most things that got said. Rowan went out to the afternoon work. Eli went back to the barn. Elena stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet house. Then she got her coat and went out to the garden, to the 3 rows she'd planted in the south-facing bed, and crouched down to check the soil. The wind was doing its thing. The sky was the color of old pewter. It was not a beautiful day. She was still crouched there 10 minutes later when she heard boots on the garden path and didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Rowan crouched down beside her. He looked at the bare dirt for a moment. Anything coming up? Too early, she said. Another week, maybe. He picked up a piece of dry earth and turned it in his fingers. She waited because she'd learned there was usually something behind the gesture with him. the picking up of small objects when he was working toward something. My brother, he said, was nothing like me. She was still. She didn't look at him. She looked at the garden. He talked, all the time, even more than Eli, which I didn't think was possible. He laughed easy. He made friends in 10 minutes flat. He set the piece of earth down. I never understood how he did that. We grew up in the same house, and we came out completely different people. He paused. When he died, when both of them died, I kept thinking I was the wrong one left behind, that Daniel would have known how to keep Eli right, would have known the right thing to say. Elena looked at the bare rows of soil. He did know the right thing to say, she said carefully, but you kept Eli here. You didn't know what to do, and you didn't do the wrong thing. That's not nothing, Rowan. He was quiet for a moment. Calvin's not going to stop. I know. He'll come back at it from another angle. I know. She sat back on her heels. But Eli's getting louder, and the louder he gets, the harder Calvin's argument is to make. She looked at Rowan finally. We just need him to keep talking, to keep showing up. Every day he's a little more present is a day Calvin has less ground to stand on. He looked at her for a moment. The wind moved between them and went on. You're already thinking 3 moves ahead. I'm a chess player, she said. Badly, but still. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in it that hadn't been there in the early days. Not the evaluating look from the train station, not the careful assessment of the first week, but something more like recognition, like a man who had sent a letter expecting something reasonable and useful, and had gotten back something he hadn't had a word for at the time and was only now beginning to name. He said, I'm glad you came. She looked back at the garden. Her throat had done a thing she wasn't prepared for. Me too, she said. They stayed crouched in the dirt for another moment, and then a sound came from the direction of the barn, not the calf, not this time. A voice. Eli's voice, carrying across the yard on the Kansas wind, saying something to Clover in the continuous narrating way he'd developed, the same tone he used for explaining things, for simply saying what was happening out loud. They couldn't make out the words from where they were crouching. It didn't matter. What mattered was the carrying of it, the way the sound moved across the open ground and reached them where they were. Rowan stood up slowly. He looked toward the barn. His face was doing a thing she recognized now, the thing it did when he felt something and was deciding whether that was allowed. She stood up beside him. He's going to be loud again, she said. Give him time. Daniel was loud, he said. Eli's going to be loud in his own way, she said, which might be a different kind of loud. That's fine too. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the fence post. He put it on. He looked at the barn for another moment and then at Elena, and there was something clear in it, something that had come a long way to get to his face and had finally arrived. I'm going to go check on him, he said. All right, she said. He went. She watched him cross the yard in that long, deliberate stride, the one that covered ground without looking like it was trying to, and she watched him stop at the barn door and lean against the frame in a way that was so deliberately casual it was almost tender, the way you approach something you don't want to startle. She watched him stay there, just outside the light, just listening, not going in, not interrupting, just being close to it. She turned back to her garden. She checked the soil one more time, pressing her fingers into the dirt, feeling the temperature of it, still too cold for the seeds she'd planted, but warming, the kind of ground that was almost ready. She stood up and brushed her hands on her skirt and went in to start supper. That evening, at the table, all 3 of them at the table, which had become the quiet, ordinary habit of the last week, Eli ate his food and drank his water, and at some point during the meal said, without looking at either of them, directed at somewhere in the middle of the table but clearly meant to land with both of them, The Aldermans have a dog. Mrs. Alderman told me. She said maybe I could see it sometime. Elena passed the butter without missing a beat. That sounds like something worth doing, she said. Rowan said, Frank Alderman's dog is an idiot, but she's friendly. He said it in exactly the tone he'd use with any statement of fact. You'd probably like her. Eli considered this. What's her name? I don't remember. Bean, maybe? Something like that? Eli looked at his plate. That's not a good name. No, Rowan agreed. It isn't. A small silence. Then, quietly, Eli said, "Clover is a better name." "Clover is a significantly better name," Elena said. Eli ate a piece of bread. His ears were pink, but the rest of his face was composed and serious in the way that she now knew was his version of pleased. It was not a triumphant moment. It was not the kind of thing you could point to and say, "There, that's where it turned." It was just supper. 3 people at a table talking about a dog's bad name and a calf's good one. The fire in the stove, the wind outside, the ordinary particular texture of an evening that didn't know it was important. But Elena felt it anyway. The weight of it, the specific gravity of a small thing that meant something enormous. She felt Rowan feel it too, the slight shift in him across the table. The almost invisible unclenching that she'd been watching happened so gradually it was like watching a season change, only visible when you compared where you were now to where you'd been. She did not say anything about it. She ate her supper and asked Eli whether Clover had eaten well at the afternoon feeding and listened to his detailed, specific, increasingly long answer and refilled the water glasses and let the evening be exactly what it was. What it was enough. What it was beginning to be something. And the next morning, when Calvin Brody rode by on the main road and slowed his horse at the side of the Crane Ridge yard, what he saw was a boy running. Actually running. The first time in 9 months his legs had done that uncomplicated, unconsciously joyful thing. Running from the barn to the fence and back again, calling something over his shoulder in a voice that carried in the flat Kansas air, clear and young and unmistakably, undeniably alive. Calvin watched for a long moment. Then he rode on. He didn't say anything about it to anyone, which was, for Calvin Brody, the closest thing to an admission Elena thought she was likely to get. She was watching from the kitchen window when it happened. She saw him slow. She saw him watch. She saw him ride on. She turned back to the stove. She did not feel vindicated exactly. She felt something quieter than that and more durable. Something that did not require Calvin's acknowledgement to be true, that had been true already, that had been building in the straw of the East barn every cold morning for 2 weeks, while a boy learned the weight and warmth of something that needed him. She poured the coffee. She called Rowan in from the barn for breakfast. She listened to Eli come through the back door at a run, slightly out of breath, tracking mud across the clean floor she'd just swept, saying something about Clover and the fence and a thing he'd seen the calf do with its nose that needed immediate reporting. "Boots," she said. He stopped, looked at his feet, looked at the mud trail across the floor, had the decency to look genuinely rueful. "Sorry," he said. "Outside," she said, "and then come back and tell me about the nose." He went back out. She got the mop. Rowan came in from the barn, saw the mop, saw her face, and wisely said nothing except, "Coffee smells good," and poured himself a cup and sat down. Eli came back in, boots removed, and took his seat and reported thoroughly on the situation with Clover's nose, which involved a beetle and a strong reaction, and Eli's own editorial opinion that Clover was braver about most things, but that beetles specifically were going to be a problem going forward. Elena listened to all of it. She mopped the floor. The coffee grew warm in the pot. Outside, the Kansas morning did its enormous, indifferent, ongoing thing. It was the 37th day since she'd stepped off the train in Grover's Bend. It was the 14th day of Clover. It was the 3rd morning in a row that Eli had tracked mud across the clean floor without meaning to, and she expected it would not be the last. That was all right. She was learning to expect that. The mud on the floor became a regular feature of April. Eli tracked it in from the barn every morning, and sometimes twice in an afternoon, and Elena swept and mopped with the steady resignation of someone who has accepted that a clean floor and an 8-year-old boy with a calf to tend are simply incompatible ambitions. She stopped mentioning the boots after the 4th time, because 4 times was enough to establish that he knew the rule and was not ignoring it out of defiance, but out of the particular absorbed forgetting of a child who has somewhere important to be. She just mopped and moved on, which was more efficient and cost them less in friction. Rowan noticed this adjustment. He didn't comment on it, but she caught him watching her once. Standing in the doorway with his coffee, looking at her pushing the mop across the flagstones with Eli, already back outside, and Clover's morning report still hanging in the kitchen air. And there was something in his expression that was trying to work something out. She didn't ask what. She let him work it out. The days had a shape now that they hadn't had in those first uncertain weeks. Eli up before dawn, to the barn, the bottle, the slow business of Clover's morning. Rowan and Elena both up nearly as early, coffee, the day's work divided between them with a practicality that had become its own kind of conversation. She'd learned the cattle well enough now to be useful with them, not expert. She wouldn't pretend expertise she didn't have, but useful, which was what Rowan needed and what she'd set out to be. She'd learned which animals were trouble, which were calm, the specific geography of the 340 acres, where the fence ran soft and needed watching, where the soil changed and the grass thinned. She'd also learned Rowan. Not completely. She didn't think Rowan was the kind of person anyone learned completely, including himself. But enough. She'd learned that he did not apologize, but he acted differently after he'd been wrong about something, quietly correcting course without naming what he was correcting. She'd learned that he thought about his brother more than he ever said, and that it came out sideways in how he watched Eli and in the careful blankness he maintained whenever Daniel's name came up in conversation with neighbors. She'd learned that he trusted her judgment more than he'd expected to, and that this surprised him regularly, each small surprise visible for just a moment before he absorbed it and moved on. They were not, by any measure she could apply, a love story yet. They were two careful people building something practical together and finding, in the building, that it was also something else, something that didn't have a clean name and didn't need one, not yet. What it needed was time, and time was what the ranch was giving them, one long Kansas day after another. It was in the third week of May, 6 weeks after Clover, 7 weeks into her marriage, that the first real argument happened. It started the way real arguments usually do, which is not about the thing it appears to be about. The visible cause was a steer named Carpenter, who had gotten into the south fence and torn a section of it down overnight and wandered into the neighboring Hooper property. And the real work of getting him back had taken most of the morning and left Rowan behind on 3 other things that needed doing and in the particular mood that falling behind on ranch work produced in him, which was a wordless, kinetic frustration that made everything he touched slightly harder than it needed to be. Elena had spent the morning with Eli, who was now accompanying her on small tasks around the ranch, with an ease that would have seemed impossible 2 months ago. He handed her tools, held things steady, asked questions in the direct, practical way of a child raised around working land. He was not a chatterbox yet, might never be, that wasn't who he was becoming, but he talked, steadily, purposefully, saying what needed to be said, and sometimes saying it twice if he wasn't sure he'd been understood, which was its own particular thing, its own declaration, because a boy who was afraid of using his voice didn't bother making sure he'd been heard. She'd told him that morning that she was going to plant the second row of the kitchen garden and asked if he wanted to help. He'd said yes, then reconsidered, then said he needed to check on Clover first, which was not really a question of need at this point. Clover was 6 weeks old and thriving and conducting herself with increasing confidence around the barnyard, but which Elena understood was Eli's way of organizing his morning around the thing he loved most. Fine. She'd started the planting. He'd joined her 20 minutes later with mud already on his knees and an air of having discharged his most important obligation. They worked in the garden until nearly noon. Eli asked her what the difference was between a bean and a pea vine, and she explained it with more specificity than strictly necessary, because she'd found that he absorbed information about how things grew with the same focused attention he gave to everything Clover did, and the same information gathering seemed to help him in the same way, gave him something concrete and useful to hold on to. When they came in for lunch, Rowan was already at the table, which was unusual for midday. He had his hat on the chair beside him, and his expression had the closed quality of a man who is managing something internal and not finding it easy. Elena put bread on the table and soup from the morning pot and sat down. She could feel it, the way you feel weather before it arrives. It came when Eli, eating his soup, said without preamble, "I want to take Clover out to the east pasture this afternoon. Let her run." Elena said, "That sounds fine." And Rowan said, "No." Eli looked up. Elena looked up. Rowan had his spoon in his hand and he was looking at the table. "She's too young for the east pasture. There's a soft section on the north side of that fence where the posts are rotting. She gets out, we lose an afternoon chasing her down. I'd be with her, Eli said. Doesn't matter. She gets past you, she's gone. Rowan's voice was not unkind, but it was final in the way that a door is final when someone's closed it from the other side. Eli looked at his bowl. The set of his jaw was not sulking. It was the other thing, the pulled inward thing that she'd watched fade over 6 weeks and did not want to see come back. I wouldn't let her get past me, he said quietly. You can't watch every direction at once, Rowan said. That's not about you. That's just how it is with young animals. Eli didn't say anything else. He ate his soup, he ate his bread. He excused himself carefully the way he'd learned to do, pushing his chair back and taking his bowl to the counter, and went back outside. Elena watched him go. She waited until she heard the barn door, then she said, "That was harder than it needed to be." Rowan looked at her. Something in his face resisted. "The fence is rotten up there. I'm not wrong about that." "I didn't say you were wrong about the fence," she said. "The fence is a fixable problem. What you did to him at this table is also a fixable problem, but you have to want to fix it." "I told him no," Rowan said. "That's not—" "You told him no like he was asking to do something stupid," she said. "Like he hadn't thought about it. He's been out there with that calf for 6 weeks. He knows her. He's careful with her. And you shut him down before he finished his sentence." Rowan put his spoon down. He was very still in the way that meant something was happening under the surface. "I was trying to keep him from being disappointed when it went wrong." "I know," she said, "but Rowan, that's what you always do. You see the thing that could go wrong and you close off the possibility before it gets there. It's how you run the ranch, and it's a good way to run a ranch. But Eli is not a section of fence." She paused, choosing carefully. "He needs to try things. He needs to see that when something goes wrong, he can handle it, or that will help him handle it. Not that the door was closed before he got there." Rowan was quiet for a long time. She let the quiet be what it was. "I do that," he said finally. Not a question. "With him, yes. Often." Another silence. He picked his spoon back up and looked at the soup. "The fence does need fixing," he said, "but differently this time. Less like a defense and more like a plan." "Fix it this afternoon," she said, "and then take him out there with Clover before supper." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. "You're going to make me do the thing I said no to." "I'm going to suggest that you do the thing you would have said yes to if you'd stopped to think about it for 30 seconds, instead of reacting from the bad morning you'd already had." His jaw shifted. She watched him take that in and decide not to fight it. He pushed back from the table. "I'll need the post driver from the upper barn," he said. "Eli knows where it is," she said. "He reorganized the upper barn 2 weeks ago. He made a map." Rowan stopped. "He made a map." "Of where everything is. He drew it on brown paper and tacked it to the inside of the door." She had in fact found this deeply charming and had told no one because it seemed like the kind of thing Eli would want to show people himself, on his own terms. "Go ask him where the post driver is." Rowan picked up his hat. He stood at the door for a moment with his hand on the frame. He said without turning around, "I don't know how to do this." She looked at his back. "Do what?" "Be his—" He stopped. "Daniel was his father. I'm his uncle. I don't know what that's supposed to look like." She thought about that carefully before she answered. "I don't think it looks like anything specific," she said. "I think it looks like what you just did, fixing the fence, asking where the post driver is." She paused. "Being someone he can hear no from and still sit next to at supper." He stood there for another second. Then he put his hat on and went. She heard him cross the yard. She heard the barn door. She couldn't hear what was said inside, but she heard 2 voices and then, after a minute, 2 sets of boots crossing to the upper barn. And then a while later, the sound of a post driver in the south pasture, the rhythmic metallic weight of it, 2 sets of intervals. Rowan's and a lighter, irregular one that was Eli learning the angle and the grip. They came in for supper with matching dirt on their knees. She didn't say anything about it. She put 3 plates on the table. After supper, there was light left. The long May light that came down over the Kansas prairie like it was trying to make up for the winters. Rowan said, "Go get your calf." And Eli was out the door before the sentence finished. She watched from the porch. Rowan leaned on the east fence, and Eli brought Clover out on a loose lead, and the calf, who was at the age where everything about the world was interesting and slightly alarming, stepped into the pasture grass and did a strange sideways skipping thing that made Eli laugh. The sound of it crossed the whole yard and reached Elena where she stood. She sat down on the porch step. She pressed her back against the post and tilted her face up toward the long light, and stayed like that for a while, just listening. The calf moved in the grass. Eli's voice, narrating, providing live commentary on Clover's investigation of the east pasture. Rowan's occasional shorter responses, the wind. She thought about Indiana, about the house that had become a shell, the quiet that had no presence behind it, the particular loneliness of a life that has the right shape but the wrong weight. She thought about the letter with its careful handwriting and its completely unadorned honesty, and the morning she'd written back and the train west. She had not expected it to feel like this. She had expected practical. She had hoped for real. She had not put a name to anything beyond that because she was a person who'd learned not to anticipate things she couldn't yet see clearly. But sitting on the porch in the May light, listening to a boy laugh at a calf, she thought, carefully, without ceremony, that she might be happy. Not the large, complete kind that people described in poetry. Nothing like that. The ordinary, durable, slightly mud-tracked kind. The kind with arguments about fences and soup going cold, and the daily unremarkable difficulty of three people learning to live together. The kind that was actually livable. She thought that might be enough. She thought it might be more than enough. The following weeks moved differently than the ones before. The ranch had a momentum to it now that wasn't there when she arrived. Not that things were easier. The work was the same weight it had always been, but there was a current to the days, a sense that each one was going somewhere, building towards something rather than simply holding a line. Eli was the most visible measure of it. He had gone from silent and doorway-bound to present in a way that sometimes surprised even Elena, who had been watching it happen and still found herself occasionally caught off guard. He spoke at meals without prompting now. He had opinions about the cattle, specific and sometimes inconvenient opinions that he stated plainly and occasionally turned out to be right about, which she suspected pleased and slightly unsettled Rowan in equal measure. He had written a letter, unsolicited, on his own initiative, using the paper Elena kept in the kitchen drawer, to the Alderman farm, asking if he could come visit the dog. June Alderman had written back the same week with an invitation for Saturday. The Saturday dog visit produced 2 hours of detailed reporting when he got home, and the firm opinion that Bean was an excellent name, actually, and he had been wrong to say otherwise. Rowan said, "I told you she was friendly." Eli said, "You said she was an idiot." "She's a friendly idiot," Rowan said. "Both things." Eli considered this with the gravity he gave to taxonomic questions. "Clover is smarter," he said. "Clover is significantly smarter," Elena agreed, and meant it, because Clover had in the preceding week figured out how to open the lower barn latch, and had done so 3 times. And while this was inconvenient, it was also objectively impressive for a 2-month-old calf. It was in the first week of June that Rowan's grief finally surfaced. It came the way buried things come, not announced, not dramatic at first, just a change in atmospheric pressure, a difference in the quality of his silences. Elena noticed it on a Tuesday. He came in from the evening check later than usual, didn't eat much, went to the porch and stayed there after supper in the dark, when normally he'd come back in and go over the next day's work. She did the dishes and put Eli to bed. Eli, who now required reading before sleep, had developed specific preferences about this and was currently in the middle of a book about the westward surveys that he discussed with the enthusiasm of someone deeply invested in the cartography of territories. And then she went to the porch. Rowan was sitting on the step. She sat beside him. He didn't say anything for a while. She let the night be what it was, big, warm, full of the small sounds that June made on the Kansas prairie, the insects and the distant movement of cattle, and the breath of wind through the tall grass. Then he said, "Daniel's birthday was Thursday." She had not known this. She should have known it. She should have asked, should have kept track. And the fact that she hadn't felt like a failure of attention, a small one, but real. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." He had his forearms on his knees, hands loosely together, looking at the dark yard. "I didn't tell anyone, didn't tell Eli. Didn't want to make it a thing." He paused, which might have been a mistake. She thought about whether to say the thing she was thinking. She said it. "Did you mark it somehow? For yourself?" He was quiet. I went out to the north corner where Daniel and I used to go out there when we were kids. Just the far north corner of the property, there's a cottonwood that was big even when we were small. We used to climb it. He picked up something from the step beside him. A small, pale stone, not unlike the ones Eli kept. She wondered if he was aware of the parallel. I just went and stood there for a while. That sounds right, she said. It didn't feel like enough. She looked at his profile. What would have felt like enough? He turned the stone over. Nothing. That's the thing. He said it plainly, without self-pity, as a factual observation about the nature of loss. There isn't a thing that's enough. You just have to keep going, and eventually the day is over. She nodded. I've been thinking, he said, that I've been doing this wrong. With Eli. He stopped, started again. I thought if I just kept the ranch running, kept things stable, kept everything normal, that was the thing I could do. Provide normal. And I thought that was what he needed. It was part of what he needed, she said, but I kept trying to make it controlled, predictable, so nothing else could go wrong. He turned the stone again. It's how I handle the ranch. Something goes wrong, you fix it, you put a fence around the problem so it doesn't spread. But grief doesn't. It's not a fence problem, she said. No, he agreed. You can't fence it. I kept trying and it just... He made a gesture with one hand, the stone inside it, a motion like something seeping past a barrier. Eli was showing me that. Every day he was showing me you can't contain it, you have to go through it, and I kept trying to build him a better fence and wondering why it wasn't working. Elena looked at the dark yard. A night bird called somewhere past the barn. You're seeing it now, though, she said. Late. Not late, she said. 7 months is nothing when it comes to something like this. Some people spend their whole lives not seeing it. He looked at the stone in his hand. He said, I miss him. And the way he said it, without the controlled flatness, without the careful management, just plainly, like something that had been held underwater for a long time finally breaking the surface, was so different from every other way she'd heard him speak that she felt it as a physical thing, felt it press against her own chest and find the corresponding grief that lived in her mother's empty chair, the house sold in autumn. I know, she said. I keep seeing Eli do something, laugh, or argue about something, or go on about Clover. And it's Daniel. It looks like Daniel. Not exactly, but the shape of it, the shape of how he is. He stopped. And it's good. It's good that it's there. And it's like being relieved and hurt at the same time, constantly, and I don't know what to do with that. She thought for a moment. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. You can just feel it, both things at once. You're allowed. He looked at her. In the dark, she could see his expression, the slight unguarded quality it had when he'd said something more than he planned to. We weren't a family that talked about things, he said. If you felt it, you found a way to get through the day. That was the whole of it. I know, she said. Mine wasn't either. Different flavor of the same thing. She looked at the hands in her lap. It's not a great inheritance. He made a sound that was the surprised half laugh she'd heard only a few times. No, it isn't. They were quiet for a while. The night moved around them. Daniel would have liked you, Rowan said. She hadn't expected that. She felt it land. That's a good thing to hear, she said. He liked people who said true things, he said. He said most people are so afraid of the true things they spend all their time going around them. You don't go around them. I've learned that going around them takes more energy, she said, and I'm not patient enough for it. No, he agreed. You're not. But he said it like it was a quality he'd come to count on. They sat on the porch step until it was fully dark and the stars were doing their enormous Kansas thing overhead. Then Rowan said, I should check the barn before bed. And she said, all right. And he stood up. And then he did something she hadn't expected. He held out his hand, not in any grand way, just held it out to help her up from the step, the way you do for someone whose footing you're responsible for. She took it and stood up, and he didn't let go right away, just held on for a second or two more than was strictly necessary, his hand around hers, both of them standing in the dark in front of the house they were building a life in. Then he let go and went to the barn. She went inside and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window looking at the dark yard and the barn light and felt, in the particular cavity of her chest, where she kept the things she didn't say out loud, the weight and warmth of what was accumulating here. This life, this difficult, beautiful, ordinary, mud-tracked life. June moved through. The calving season gave way to the long, steady work of summer, mending and feeding and the 100 things that a working ranch requires regardless of the emotional weather of the people running it. Eli had stopped being a passenger in the work and started being a participant, not playing at helping but actually helping in ways that Rowan quietly acknowledged and built on, giving him more as he proved he could carry it. One afternoon, a steer needed a wound on its foreleg dressed, a cut from a wire, not deep but needing attention. Rowan started the work and Eli came and crouched beside him without being asked, watching, and then when Rowan held out the cloth and the salve without a word, Eli took them and did what needed doing carefully with the specific concentration he brought to things that required him to be precise. Rowan held the animal and directed quietly, "Press a little harder, even pressure." And Eli did exactly that. And when it was done, he sat back on his heels and looked at the finished bandage with an expression Elena, watching from 3 feet away, recognized immediately. It was the same expression she'd seen on his face the first time he'd gotten the bottle angle right with Clover, the first time he'd gotten through a whole feeding without the calf pulling away. The particular satisfaction of competence, of having done something real. Rowan looked at the bandage and said, "Good," in a tone that was not effusive and was not nothing. In Rowan's vocabulary, it was approximately equivalent to most people's considerable enthusiasm. Eli stood up. He looked at Rowan. He said, "I want to learn more of that, how to treat them when they're hurt." Rowan looked at him for a moment. "All right," he said. It was not a big moment. It was a Tuesday afternoon in June with manure on both their boots and a steer that needed to go back to the pasture. But Elena, walking back to the house with the extra bandages, felt it settle over her the way the May light had settled. That steady, durable, completely unspectacular sense of a life becoming what it was supposed to be. She thought about Rowan's hand around hers in the dark. She thought about Eli's map of the upper barn tacked to the inside of the door. She thought about a boy who'd been so silent she could hear him breathe in a crowded room, and who now, from her position at the kitchen window as she started supper, she could hear across the yard talking to a calf that no longer really needed talking to, but that stopped everything it was doing and turned its head whenever Eli spoke anyway. She put the pot on. She heard the back door, boots on the porch, the argument about taking them off, the brief silence of compliance followed by 2 sets of sock feet on the kitchen floor. She didn't turn around. "Wash your hands before you touch anything," she said. "We know," Eli said. "Both of you," she said. "I know," Rowan said in the tone of a man who has heard this before and is mildly affronted by the implication that he needed reminding, though his hands were demonstrably heading for the basin. "Good," she said, and stirred the pot, and let the kitchen fill with the sound of 2 people she had come to love, one overtly, one in the slow accumulating way that she suspected was the more durable kind, washing their hands before supper in the house they all lived in together on a piece of Kansas land that had started to feel, without drama, without announcement, entirely like home. Summer on the Flint Prairie came in like it meant business. By early July, the grass had gone from the soft green of May to something tougher and more honest, the color of straw in the late afternoon light, the kind of landscape that didn't ask whether you were ready for it and didn't wait for an answer. The heat was different from Indiana heat, drier, cleaner, with none of the humid weight Elena had grown up under. It sat on the land differently. She'd stopped minding it somewhere in June and had started, without entirely noticing the transition, to find it clarifying. Like everything unnecessary burned off, and what was left was just the actual shape of things. The ranch ran better than it had in years. Rowan said this once, plainly and without decoration, on a morning in early July when he was going over the ledger at the kitchen table, and she was making bread, and he said it in the tone of a man reporting a fact rather than offering a compliment, which meant she trusted it more than she would have trusted something warmer. She said "good," and kept working the dough, and he went back to the ledger, and that was the whole of it. But she carried it with her the rest of the day like a stone that fits well in the pocket, Eli by July was unrecognizable from the boy she had met on the porch steps in April, and also entirely recognizable because what he had become was more himself, not a different self. The same dark eyes, the same serious way of working through a problem, the same stone in his left front pocket, which he still carried and which she had never once mentioned. But the space he inhabited had expanded. He took up room now, not in an aggressive way, just in the natural way of a person who has stopped trying to be small. He talked through meals, he talked in the barn, he talked while doing the feeding and the fencing and the water trough checks, a steady, narrating presence that Rowan had adapted to with the specific patience of a man who remembered what its absence felt like and found he preferred the noise. He had opinions about the cattle, about the weather, about the book on Westward surveying that he had finished and now quoted at intervals, about being the alderman dog, whom he had visited 3 more times and whose intelligence he had revised significantly upward from his initial assessment. He did not talk about his parents. Not yet. That was still somewhere he moved around rather than through, and Elena did not push at its edges. There would be time. She'd learned the difference over these months between a door that was locked and a door that wasn't ready to open, and Eli's door on that particular room was the second kind. It would open. It would open because he was not the same boy who had stood in the doorway of the barn at 2 in the morning, holding the frame with both hands, deciding whether to exist in the world or recede from it. He had decided. He just needed more time for the harder decisions. And time was something that Crane Ridge, with its long summer days and its steady work and its gradually accumulated sense of safety, had in sufficient supply. The thing that happened in the second week of July was not dramatic in any external sense. It was a Sunday, which on a working ranch means approximately the same as any other day except that Rowan moved through it slightly more slowly, allowing for something that in another household might have been called rest. They had eaten a late breakfast. Eli had gone to the barn. Elena was on the porch with coffee when she saw the Brody wagon coming up the road. She watched it come. She set her coffee cup down on the porch rail and stood up and waited. Calvin climbed down from the wagon alone. No Marvell, no other visitors. He tied the horse and came toward the porch with his hat in his hands, which Elena had not seen before. Calvin Brody was a man who wore his hat like armor. He held it at his side now and looked up at her and said, "Mrs. Mercer, is Rowan about?" "He's in the upper barn," she said. "I can get him. If it's all right, I'd like to speak to both of you, together." He looked at the hat in his hands. "Won't take long." She studied him for a moment. He looked older than he had in April, or maybe she was just seeing him more clearly now, without the adversarial filter she'd needed then. He was not a comfortable man this morning. She didn't think Calvin Brody was often uncomfortable, and she thought the fact that he'd come here in that condition meant something. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get Rowan." She went to the upper barn and told Rowan, who came back with the expression he wore when he was preparing to manage something. She touched his arm briefly as they walked back and said quietly, "Wait and see." And he looked at her and adjusted. Calvin was sitting on the porch step. He stood up when they came around the corner, which was also new. Calvin stood up for very few people. He said without preamble, "I came to say I was wrong." Rowan was very still. Calvin turned the hat in his hands once. "About Eli. About the institution in Salina. About all of it." He looked at Rowan directly. "I've watched that boy this summer, seen him around, heard him at the alderman's when I was over there for a fence discussion last week. He was telling Frank's wife something about a calf, and it took me a full minute to recognize him because I was expecting—" He stopped. "I was expecting what he was, not what he is." He shifted his weight. "I owe you both an apology, and I owe the boy one too, I suppose, though I'll let you decide whether that does more good than harm at this point." The silence lasted a few seconds. A meadowlark was going about its business somewhere past the west fence. Rowan said, "Eli's in the barn if you want to tell him yourself." Calvin looked at him. He'd been expecting, Elena thought, either forgiveness or argument, and Rowan had given him something more useful than either, a direction. "All right," Calvin said. "All right, I will." He walked to the barn. Elena and Rowan stayed on the porch. She watched Rowan watch him go. "You all right?" she said. "Yeah." he said. Then, he doesn't do that. Apologize. I know. Something must have... He stopped. He watched Eli at the Alderman's, she said. He saw it. That's what changed it. She picked up her coffee cup. Some people need to see the thing to believe it. That's not the worst quality in a person. Rowan looked at her sideways. You're being generous. I'm being practical, she said. He's going to be our neighbor for the rest of our lives. He came here on a Sunday with his hat in his hands. That counts for something. Rowan looked at the barn. Eli might not want to hear it. Eli can handle more than you think, she said. He's been handling things since October. He's better at it than you're giving him credit for. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, simply, You're right, in the tone he used when he'd genuinely come around to something, not when he was conceding to end a conversation. It still surprised her a little every time. She didn't think she'd ever entirely stop being surprised by it, which she thought was probably a good thing. They could hear distantly from the direction of the barn the sound of voices. 2 of them. They couldn't make out words. Elena didn't try to. Calvin came back out 7 minutes later. He walked to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps and said, He showed me the calf. He looked slightly rearranged, like a room where someone had moved the furniture a few inches. Not dramatically different, just different. Named her Clover. He did, Rowan said. He said she was smart. Calvin put his hat on. Told me about the latch she figured out, in some detail. She's opened it 5 times, Elena said. He said 6. Calvin looked between them. He said he retied it with a different knot and she's been studying it for a week. Something in his face shifted again. That uncertain quality she'd seen at the gathering in April, but softer now, less like ground moving under him and more like a man settling into a new and slightly humbling understanding. He's going to be all right, he said. Yes, Elena said. He is. Calvin nodded. He walked back to his wagon. He climbed up, took the reins, then paused and looked back at them. I'll send Roy Hooper over this week with the post he owes Rowan from the spring trade, he said, which was as close to a continued overture as Calvin Brody was likely to make. Been sitting at his place too long. I'll tell him to expect them, Rowan said. Calvin drove out. Rowan looked at Elena. She looked back at him. He said, 6 times. She opened it 6 times, Elena confirmed. I didn't want to correct him in April when he was still working up to the apology. The corner of his mouth moved. You counted wrong on purpose. I miscounted by 1, she said, in the direction of a more interesting story. He shook his head, but the almost smile stayed. He went back to the upper barn. She went back to her coffee, which had gone cold while they were dealing with Calvin Brody's conscience, and drank it cold because it was still coffee and she wasn't wasteful. Eli came out of the barn 20 minutes later and crossed the yard to the porch and sat down on the step below her without being invited, which meant he'd decided it was his step as much as anyone's, which it was. She waited. He said he was sorry, Eli said. I know. He said he didn't understand before. He picked at a splinter on the step. He said Clover was impressive. She is impressive. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't tell him he was forgiven. She looked at the side of his face. That's all right. Forgiveness isn't something you have to hand over just because someone asks for it. It comes when it comes. He considered this. Does it always come? She thought about that honestly, because he deserved an honest answer more than a comfortable one. Not always, she said, but it's lighter to carry than the other thing. Most people find that eventually. He nodded slowly, working it through. Then he said, I was glad he came. She looked at him. Even though I was glad he came. He looked at his hands. It felt better than if he'd just kept thinking it. Yeah, she said. It does. He sat there another minute and then said he was going back to check on Clover's progress with the new knot, which was apparently a developing situation, and went. She sat on the porch in the July heat and thought about what he'd said. It felt better than if he'd just kept thinking it. An 8-year-old working out the difference between an apology that comes and one that doesn't, and landing on gratitude for the one that came even without the words he'd have wanted around it. She thought that was a kind of wisdom that had been hard-earned and came from places she'd rather he hadn't had to go, and she thought it was also going to serve him well for the rest of his life. You cannot protect children from the things that shape them. You can only try to be there when those things happen, and stay there after, and trust that the shape they're becoming is one they can live inside. She'd thought that for a long time. She'd just never had anyone to apply it to the way she'd applied it here. The last piece came together on a Saturday at the end of July. It was not a planned moment. Nothing at Crane Ridge ever happened in a planned moment. She'd noticed that the things that mattered most arrived sideways. Between other things, wearing ordinary clothes. This one arrived while she was at the kitchen table going over the household accounts, which she'd taken on in June with Rowan's agreement and a degree of relief on his part that he didn't try to hide. Eli was in the yard. She could see him through the window. He'd taken to working with Clover in the late afternoon, leading her on the long rope around the perimeter of the south yard, which served the dual purpose of exercise for the calf and some kind of meditative circuit for Eli, who seemed to think best while moving slowly. Clover was 4 months old now and had the particular confidence of a young animal who had been handled well from birth and knew it, swinging her head and moving with a loose-limbed ease that made the whole performance look less like training and more like two friends taking a walk. Rowan came in from the east field and stopped at the kitchen door and stood watching Eli and Clover through the screen. He had his hat off, turning it in his hands the way he did when he was working toward something. Elena watched him from the table without saying anything, waiting. He came in and sat down across from her. He looked at the accounts for a moment, not reading them, just looking at them. And then he looked up at her and said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. He set the hat down on the table. He looked at his hands. She had come to understand that this sequence, hat on the table, look at the hands, was Rowan Mercer's version of taking a breath. "I know what this was supposed to be," he said, "when you came, what we agreed to, practical, real, a life worth building." He looked up. "And I know it hasn't been simple. The situation with Eli and Calvin and all of it." "No," she agreed. "It hasn't been simple. And I know 5 weeks in you were already mopping floors at midnight because I didn't know how to tell a boy to leave his boots outside without starting a hole." He stopped, recalibrated. "I'm not good at this," he said, meaning the speaking of it, the direct approach. She could see him working against his own grain, and she did not look away. "You're better at it than you were in April," she said. "That's a low bar," he said. "Clearing low bars still counts," she said. He almost smiled. It went away quickly because he was serious about this, and she could see that. "I want to ask you to stay," he said, "not because you agreed to it, not because of the papers we signed in the county clerk's office, because—" He stopped again, found the word he'd been working toward. "Because this is yours, this place. It's yours. And I didn't expect that. I don't know what I expected, something useful and decent. I didn't expect someone who would become the reason this whole thing—" He gestured, not at the room, but at the air, at some larger arrangement he didn't have words for. "The reason it works," he said. "The reason it feels like something real." The kitchen was quiet except for the clock and the distant sound of Eli saying something to Clover in the yard. Elena looked at Rowan Mercer across the table. This man she'd known for 4 months. This man she'd built a life beside in the particular compressed and intense way that hard work and close quarters produce. This man who still turned his hat in his hands when he was afraid of something, and who had learned, slowly and with real effort, that control is not the same as care. She thought about the letter with its careful handwriting. She thought about the train and the big sky getting bigger. She thought about a cold barn at 2 a.m. and a choice that had cost her nothing and started everything. She said, "Rowan, I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her. "This is mine," she said. "You're mine. Eli is mine. I decided that a long time ago, probably on the train, if I'm being accurate about it." She folded her hands on the table. "You don't have to ask me to stay. You might have to ask me sometime to slow down, or to let you do something yourself without managing it, or to stop reorganizing the upper barn because apparently that's Eli's project now, and I should leave it alone. You reorganized the upper barn," he said. "Once," she said, "and then Eli did it better, which is fine. The point is, I'm not leaving. I am here, and I plan to keep being here." She paused. But I'm glad you asked." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table, but just his hand, set flat beside hers, not covering it, just there, close enough to feel the warmth of it. "Good," he said. She put her hand over his. They sat like that for a moment, and then he turned his hand over and held hers properly, and they were two imperfect people at a kitchen table in the July heat on a working ranch in Kansas, and it was not a scene from any kind of story that had music behind it or light falling at the right angle. It was just what it was, which was everything. Outside, Eli had stopped walking the circuit. She could see him through the window, standing in the middle of the yard, Clover's rope loose in his hand, looking at something in the east field. A bird, maybe, or just the particular color of the afternoon light on the grass. Clover stood beside him with her jaw moving in the lazy way of a contented animal, her ears swiveling. Eli said something to her. Clover's ear turned toward him. He'd been doing that lately, talking to Clover not about Clover, not narrating her behavior or reporting her progress, but just talking, saying whatever was in his head. Elena had caught fragments of it over the past few weeks, observations about the weather, about something Frank Alderman's wife had said, about a passage from the survey book, once a long and winding account of a dream he'd had that involved the barn and a very large number of beetles. He talked to Clover the way you talk to someone who knows you completely and requires nothing from you except your presence. She thought he might be talking to his parents, some of the time, not to the calf, through the calf. Using Clover as the interlocutor for everything he couldn't yet say out loud to people who might respond, who might show on their faces what his words cost them. She didn't say this to anyone. It was his, whatever it was. When the door opened, he'd open it himself. August arrived, and with it the particular satisfaction of a summer's work coming into its final shape. The cattle were good. The garden had produced beyond what Elena had cautiously hoped. The beans, especially, which Eli had taken it upon himself to pick daily with a thoroughness that was partly responsibility and partly the fact that he and Clover had worked out a system where she was allowed one bean per feeding in what Eli insisted was a treat and Elena suspected was a bribe. The accounts were in better order than they'd been in 3 years. Rowan mentioned this a second time, again in the tone of a fact rather than a compliment, and Elena accepted it in the same spirit. The neighbors came and went with a different quality than they had in the spring. Roy Hooper brought the fence posts and stayed for coffee and left having had a conversation with Eli about cattle medicine that Roy later told Frank Alderman had genuinely surprised him. Frank and June Alderman came for a Sunday meal in August, and June spent an hour in the kitchen with Elena talking about the garden and seed saving and the particular difficulty of keeping anything green alive through a Kansas August. And when she left, she pressed Elena's hand and said, "We were worried about Rowan, before you came. We didn't know if he'd manage." She paused. "He's managing." "He was always managing," Elena said. "He just had too much to carry alone." June looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has seen a great deal and recognizes something true. "Yes," she said. "That's it exactly." Even Calvin Brody came back once more, in late August, with Marvell in what turned out to be a genuine social call rather than any kind of campaign. Marvell brought a cake. Calvin sat on the porch with Rowan and talked about fence and water rights and the coming fall sale, rancher talk, neighborly and ordinary, and at no point mentioned institutions in Salina or the state of anyone's mind. When Eli came in from the barn, Calvin said, "How's the calf?" And Eli told him at some length, and Calvin listened with the specific attention of a man making good on a decision he'd made about himself. It was not, Elena thought, a full redemption. People didn't work that way, not in 4 months or 4 years. Calvin Brody was still a man who had decided too quickly and spoken too loudly and caused real harm in the process, and that didn't disappear because he'd come to the porch with his hat in his hands. But he was also a man who had been wrong and admitted it, and was now sitting in his neighbor's yard listening to a 9-year-old explain the dietary preferences of a calf, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, the most useful kind of change. Not dramatic, not announced, just a man being different in the small daily ways that add up to something over time. She thought about that a lot, as August wound down toward the cooler edge of September, about what change actually looks like when it's real, how it doesn't arrive with music or a clear moment of before and after. How Eli's return to language had not been one day silent and the next day talking, but weeks of slow, incremental movement. One word to Clover, one name given and held, one question asked, one meal eaten at the table, one morning arriving at the barn before she got there because he decided it was his responsibility and he was going to meet it. How Rowan's opening, the careful, difficult loosening of a man who had taught himself to need nothing, had been not a single confession on the porch, but 100 small moments of choosing differently, choosing to let Eli try things, choosing to say the true thing at the kitchen table, choosing to hold her hand for 2 seconds longer than was strictly necessary in the dark of the front yard and mean something by it. That was what she wanted to have learned from all of it. That was the thing she turned over in her mind, the way Eli turned his stone, the way Rowan turned his hat. That healing is not an event. It is a practice. It is the same as any other kind of work. You show up for it daily. You do the task in front of you. You don't expect the field to be ready just because you want it to be. You check the soil. You wait for the right temperature. You plant and you tend, and some things come up and some things don't, and you keep doing it the next day anyway. She had not known that, not really, not in her bones, before she came to this place. She'd understood it theoretically, the way she'd understood most things she'd read about but not lived through. Living through it was different. Living through it meant a cold barn at 2 a.m. and a gathering in someone's parlor where she was the least established person in the room, and arguments about fences that were about something else, and a boy who said, "Tell them Clover's doing fine," and meant something enormous by those 5 words. It meant failing sometimes. She had failed, she knew that. There were things she'd handled clumsily, things she'd said that landed wrong, things she'd been so focused on Eli that she'd missed in Rowan, things she'd missed in herself. She was not a fixed thing any more than the people around her were. She was in process, too. She thought she would always be. That was fine. That was, she'd come to believe, the actual human condition, and the people who presented themselves as finished products were either lying or had simply stopped paying attention. On an evening in the first week of September, with the heat finally relenting and the Kansas sky doing something complicated and beautiful in the direction of the sunset, Elena came out to the porch and found Rowan and Eli already there. Rowan was in the chair, Eli on the step. Clover was in the yard, which she should not have been. She'd figured out not number 3 sometime in the previous week, but no one seemed to be in a hurry to address this. She sat down on the step beside Eli. They watched Clover investigate the porch with the confident curiosity of an animal who knows she is not supposed to be somewhere and considers this insufficient reason to leave. Eli said, "She's going to try to come up the steps." "She is not coming up the steps," Rowan said. "She will, though," Eli said, with the calm certainty of someone who had logged considerable hours studying the subject. Clover put one hoof on the bottom step. "Clover," Rowan said. Clover looked at him. She put the hoof back down. She looked at Eli. "Don't," Eli said. Clover looked at him for a long moment with the expression of an animal making a cost-benefit calculation. Then she turned and walked back to the middle of the yard and resumed her investigation of the grass. Eli said, "She listened to me." "She decided it wasn't worth it," Rowan said. "Different thing." "I don't think so," Eli said. Elena looked at the sunset. The sky was the color of something she didn't have a name for, all the warm shades at once, the kind of sky that would have made a lesser person reach for poetry. She just looked at it. It was enough to look at it. After a while, Eli said, without particular build-up, into the cooling evening air, "I think my dad would have liked Clover." Neither Elena nor Rowan said anything immediately. This was the first time. The first time he'd reached for his parents in conversation instead of around them, reached toward rather than away. "He would have," Rowan said after a moment. Carefully. Not making a production of it, not shutting it down, just answering. "Your dad liked anything with a personality." "She has a personality," Eli said. "She really does," Rowan agreed. A pause. The sunset continued its business. "My mom would have said she was too smart," Eli said. "She always said smart animals were trouble." "She was right about that," Rowan said. "She was right about a lot of things," Eli said. He said it simply, not with the fragile quality Elena would have expected even a month ago, but with a kind of settled sorrow, the weight of something that had been looked at long enough to be held. I've been trying to remember everything she said. All of it, so I don't forget. Rowan looked at his hands, looked out at the yard. He said, I can help with that, if you want. I remember a lot of things, Clara said. Eli looked at him. And Daniel, Rowan said, I remember your dad said a lot of things. Most of them were either funny or wrong, but there were some good ones in there. The corner of Eli's mouth went up, not the tiny, barely there movement from April. A real one, visible and held. Tell me one, he said. Rowan thought about it. Elena watched him go somewhere inside himself and come back with something he'd been keeping. He used to say, when something went wrong on the ranch, when something he couldn't fix happened, he'd say, well, we're still here. He paused. Just that. We're still here. Like that was enough to keep going. And it usually was. Eli was quiet for a moment. He turned the stone over in his hand, that smooth gray stone he'd carried since October, that he'd never explained and she'd never asked about. He looked at it. Then he closed his hand around it and looked out at Clover, who had found something in the grass worth examining. We're still here, Eli said, testing the shape of it, trying it on. Yeah, Rowan said, we are. Elena looked at the sky. The colors were changing, deepening. The first star had arrived somewhere above the east field. She thought about a letter in a stack of mail, handwriting careful as a man choosing lumber. She thought about the word honest, and all the ways it had turned out to be the right word, the word that ran under everything like a creek under flat ground, making things grow. She thought about what it meant to choose a life rather than wait for one, and what it meant to find that the life you'd chosen had more in it than you'd been able to imagine when you were reading about it in a kitchen in Indiana with your heart still tender from loss. She was not the person she'd been in March. She was not sure she could say yet exactly who she was becoming. That was all right. She had time. She had this porch, and this ranch, and this sky, and these two people beside her, one of them holding a stone, and one of them turning his hat in his hands, and all of them, without having planned it or performed it, belonging to each other in the particular way that only honesty and difficulty and time can make. Cold's coming, Rowan said. Not sadly, just noticing. Good, Eli said. Clover's coat is coming in thick. She'll be fine. What about you? Elena said. Your coat coming in thick? He looked at her with the expression he wore when she said something that was trying to be funny. I have an actual coat, he said. In the closet. I'm not a calf. Debatable, Rowan said. Eli looked at him. That doesn't even make sense. Sure it does. How does that make sense? You both opened a latch you weren't supposed to, Rowan said. Last Tuesday. Elena put her hand over her mouth. Eli's ears went very pink. That was an accident. Was it? The latch was... He stopped, reconsidered. I was testing something. Rowan said. I was. All right. Eli looked at Elena for support and found none forthcoming and turned back to the yard with the dignity of someone who has decided to let it go. Clover looked up at him from the grass as if she knew she was part of this conversation and had opinions. Don't, Eli told her. Clover went back to the grass. Elena laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a careful laugh. A real one, the kind that comes from somewhere below the sternum and doesn't ask permission. Rowan made the surprised half sound that she'd learned was his laugh. And Eli, after a moment of attempted outrage, made a noise that was unmistakably the same thing, and the sound of it went out across the yard and into the big Kansas evening and dissolved into the darkening air. Clover ignored all of them. The stars were coming out properly now, the way they came out on the prairie, without obstruction, filling in from the east, more stars than any reasonable sky needed. Eli leaned his shoulder against Elena's arm. Not dramatically, just settling there the way a person settles against something solid when they've been standing for a long time, and have decided it's safe to stop standing quite so straight. She didn't comment on it. She just stayed where she was. Rowan reached over and put his hand on the back of her chair. Not her shoulder, just the chair. But there. The three of them sat in the September evening while the sky went dark, and the calf moved in the yard, and the ranch settled into the sounds it made at night. And nobody said anything for a while because nothing needed to be said. All the hard work of the year was still in them. The 2 a.m. barn in the cold April, and the parlor meeting, and the argument about the fence, and the stone kept in the pocket, and the word spoken to a calf in a moment so small it almost didn't happen. All of it was still there, unchanged, none of it erased or resolved into something prettier than it was. They were still here. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.